Picture this. It's December 1847 in what we now call Colorado Territory, and death is stalking through the snow like some kind of frontier grim reaper. Now, when I say death, I don't mean the romantic Hollywood version where someone coughs delicately into a handkerchief and expires gracefully. I'm talking about the kind of death that comes when your cabin walls might as well be made of tissue paper against 40 degrees below zero, and you're burning your kitchen table just to keep your children's breath from freezing in their lungs. Elias Hartwell was there, counting bodies. 17 graves that winter. 17. Think about that number for a moment. In a settlement of maybe 60 souls, that's more than a quarter of your entire community just gone, claimed by cold that could kill you as surely as any bullet or blade, but slower, more methodically, more cruelly. Hartwell was a Swedish engineer, and like a lot of engineers, he was the kind of man who looked at problems and couldn't help but see solutions. But this particular problem was eating his savings faster than a gambler in a rigged poker game. Every cord of firewood cost what a man might make in a week of hard labor, and the firewood, well, it disappeared into those ravenous stoves like offerings to some hungry god that was never quite satisfied. He'd watch his neighbors, good people, hard-working people, feeding their furniture to the flames. First the extra chairs, then the good table, then the floorboards themselves. Anything that would burn, anything that might buy another hour, another night, another sunrise for their families. And Hartwell, with his engineer's mind, kept thinking there had to be a better way. There had to be. The revelation came during what the old-timers still call the Christmas blizzard of 1847. Picture the worst snowstorm you've ever experienced, then multiply it by about 10. Hartwell had been checking on the Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who'd lost their eldest son the week before, when the storm hit like nature's own artillery barrage. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind was screaming like a living thing, and the snow was coming down so thick it was like trying to breathe underwater. He barely made it to a limestone cave about 200 yards up the hillside. Barely. We're talking about crawling on hands and knees, following the rock face by touch, convinced every step might be his last. But when he finally stumbled into that cave, gasping and half-frozen, something remarkable happened. 30 feet inside the mountain, just 30 feet, his thermometer read 55 degrees. No fire, no fuel, no desperate burning of precious possessions. Just the earth itself, holding warmth like a mother holding a child. Now, this is where Hartwell's background becomes crucial. This wasn't just some random frontiersman having a lucky moment. This was a man who'd grown up hearing his grandmother's stories about the old country, about Swedish earth houses that stayed warm when the surface world turned deadly. His grandmother used to tell him about families who lived through winters that would have killed anyone above ground, and they did it by embracing the earth instead of fighting it. But it wasn't just folklore rattling around in his head. Hartwell had spent time studying Ute winter camps, and he'd noticed something the other settlers missed. When the temperature outside dropped to levels that could freeze a man solid in minutes, the Ute would disappear into hillside shelters that seemed to generate their own warmth. Not mystical, not magical, just practical knowledge passed down through generations about how the earth itself could be your ally instead of your enemy. His mining background told him limestone caves maintained steady temperatures year-round. The geology made sense, the physics made sense. But more than that, his desperate arithmetic made sense. 3 years of digging, brutal back-breaking work, yes. But 3 years of digging versus 30 years of buying firewood, at prices that would bankrupt a king. The math was simple. The decision was not. Because when Hartwell stumbled back to his cabin that night, he had to convince his wife Margaret that moving into the mountain wasn't the desperate plan of a man driven mad by cold and loss. Margaret was pregnant with their second child, managing a toddler and a household in conditions that would challenge a seasoned homesteader. And her husband wanted to tell her they were going to dig into a hillside like what? Exactly. The local pastor, Reverend Morrison, made his position crystal clear when word got around about Hartwell's plan. Only the dead should dwell beneath the earth, he declared from his pulpit, and you can imagine how that went over in a community that had just buried 17 souls. The good Reverend wasn't just expressing theological concerns, he was voicing the fears of people who saw caves as places where you went to die, not live. But Hartwell had an answer that became frontier legend, the kind of response that gets repeated around campfires and dinner tables for generations. When Morrison warned him about dwelling with the dead, Hartwell looked the man straight in the eye and said, "Then I choose to live with the dead rather than die with the living." Think about the weight of those words. This is a man who's just spent 3 months watching his neighbors feed their homes to fires that were never quite enough, watching children cough themselves to sleep in beds that might as well have been placed in a meat locker. He's done the math, seen the solution, and he's not going to be deterred by conventional wisdom that's killing people. Margaret, pregnant and practical, asked the only question that really mattered. "Can you do it, Elias? Can you really do it?" And her husband, the Swedish engineer who'd found warmth in the heart of a Kuppares mountain, looked at his wife and children and gave the only answer that made sense. "I have to." Because sometimes, when conventional wisdom is failing and people are dying, the most radical thing you can do is dig deeper. Sometimes the solution isn't to build higher walls or burn brighter fires. Sometimes you have to stop fighting the mountain and start asking it to be your home. The question hanging in the frozen air of that December night in 1847 wasn't whether Elias Hartwell was crazy. The question was whether he was crazy enough to save his family, his neighbors, and maybe even redefine how human beings could live in harmony with the earth itself. And that question, well, that question was about to reshape the American frontier in ways nobody could have imagined. Spring 1848 arrived like a pardon from nature's death sentence, but Elias Hartwell wasn't celebrating the thaw. He was planning an invasion. Not of enemy territory, but of the earth itself. And let me tell you, when you're talking about digging into a mountainside with 1800s technology, you're essentially declaring war on geology, armed with hand tools and sheer bloody-minded determination. Hartwell's first cuts into the hillside followed a 20-degree downward angle. Now, that might not sound like much, but think about it this way. You're not just digging a hole, you're creating a tunnel that needs to be wide enough for a wagon, stable enough not to collapse and kill everyone inside, and engineered well enough to last decades. This isn't some desperate prairie dog burrow we're talking about. This is architecture carved from living rock. Where did a Swedish engineer in the middle of nowhere, Colorado, learn to do this? Roman mine engineering texts he'd studied back in Stockholm. Picture that for a moment. A man sitting in a frozen cabin, reading about techniques the Romans used to extract silver from Spanish mountains, and thinking, well, if it worked for them, maybe it'll work for me. That's the kind of intellectual audacity that built the American frontier. By summer, Hartwell had done something remarkable. He'd convinced 2 other men to join what most people considered a suicide mission. Jonas Kowalski was a Polish quarryman who'd come west not for gold or land, but because tuberculosis was eating his lungs, and the doctors told him mountain air might buy him a few more years. When Kowalski heard about Hartwell's plan, he saw something the others missed, a chance to use his stone-cutting skills to build something permanent, instead of just blasting rocks apart. But the real game-changer was Samuel Standing Bear, a Ute elder who'd been watching these crazy white settlers freeze to death every winter, and probably wondering when they'd figure out what his people had known for generations. Standing Bear didn't just offer to help, he brought knowledge that turned Hartwell's engineering theory into practical reality. Together, they developed what they called the triple arch support system. Picture 3 interlocking arches of limestone blocks, fitted together without mortar, each one supporting the others in a pattern that could hold up the weight of the mountain above. Standing Bear remembered these techniques from ancient ruins his grandfather had shown him, structures that had been standing for centuries when the first Spanish explorers stumbled across them. This wasn't just construction, this was cultural fusion at its finest. Swedish engineering precision, Polish stone-cutting expertise, and Native American ancestral knowledge, all focused on one impossible goal: making the mountain into a home. But then came August 1849, and nature decided to test just how serious these 3 men were about their underground ambitions. Hartwell struck an underground stream. Now, when I say struck, I don't mean he found a gentle trickle of water. I mean his careful excavation suddenly became a raging torrent that threatened to wash away 3 years of work in about 3 hours. Picture the worst basement flood you've ever seen, then imagine it's happening 40 feet underground with no easy way to escape and tons of rock overhead just waiting for an excuse to come crashing down. For 6 days, Hartwell and 12 volunteers worked in shifts around the clock, building French drains and cisterns while standing waist-deep in freezing water that could have killed them all. These weren't professional miners or engineers. These were farmers and shopkeepers and immigrants who'd never seen anything like this before. But they worked like their lives depended on it, because their lives did depend on it. Margaret Hartwell, meanwhile, was managing their traditional cabin with 2 young children and watching her husband's dream turn into what looked like an expensive way to drown underground. The family savings were gone. The project was flooded. Half the settlement thought Elias had finally lost his mind completely. So what did Margaret do? She sold her wedding silver, the last valuable thing they owned, to buy the pipes that would channel all that water into useful irrigation. Think about that decision for a moment. Your husband is literally underwater, pursuing what everyone thinks is a fool's errand, and you take your most precious possession and bet it all on his vision. That's not just love. That's the kind of frontier courage that built a nation. The water crisis turned into an unexpected blessing. Those French drains and cisterns that nearly killed them to build, they ended up providing the settlement with the purest water supply anyone had ever tasted. Crystal clear, perfectly filtered through limestone, and available year-round. Suddenly, Hartwell's underground disaster was looking like underground genius. But October brought a different kind of challenge entirely. Hartwell hit granite. Not just a granite outcropping, a granite mass the size of a railroad car, sitting right in the path of his main tunnel like some geological middle finger pointed directly at his ambitions. Now, the obvious solution was dynamite, blast it apart and haul out the pieces. But Hartwell had 40 feet of excavated tunnel behind him, and the constant worry that one wrong explosion could bring the whole mountain down on his head. So instead of taking the easy way out, he spent 3 weeks with a sledgehammer and wedge, breaking that granite monster into manageable pieces 1 swing at a time. 3 weeks. Picture that kind of determination. Every morning, climbing down into the earth with a 20-pound sledgehammer, knowing you're going to spend the next 12 hours beating on a rock that's been sitting in that exact spot since before human beings walked upright. The neighbors were placing bets on when he'd give up. Even Kowalski and Standing Bear were starting to worry their partner had finally snapped under the pressure. But Hartwell kept swinging, day after day, swing after swing, until that granite mass was nothing but manageable chunks that could be hauled out by hand and incorporated into the tunnel walls. They called it the Battle of the Boulders, and when it was over, Hartwell had proven something important to everyone watching, including himself. He wasn't just committed to this project, he was committed beyond all reasonable limits. By winter 1850, Hartwell had carved out 4 rooms 40 feet below ground level, each connected by arched passages that created natural air circulation, but his masterstroke, the innovation that turned skeptics into believers, was the light well system. Vertical shafts with polished copper plates that reflected sunlight deep into the living spaces, turning what should have been a dark cave into bright, livable rooms. When the thermometers above ground hit 30 below zero that winter, Hartwell's underground home held steady at 58 degrees. No fire, no fuel, no desperate burning of furniture or floorboards. Just the earth's own warmth, captured and held by human ingenuity, and 3 years of back-breaking labor. The question was no longer whether Elias Hartwell was crazy. The question was whether the rest of the settlement was crazy for not following his example. And that question was about to be answered in the most dramatic way possible, on a Christmas Eve that would change everything. Christmas Eve, 1850. Picture this scene. A wagon train of 17 souls, including 3 infants, stumbling into the settlement with frostbite so severe that 2 men had already lost toes to the cold. These weren't greenhorn settlers making rookie mistakes. These were experienced frontier families who'd been caught by an early blizzard that turned a routine journey into a fight for survival. Every cabin in the settlement was packed beyond capacity. Fires were running dangerously low because nobody had expected to house and heat additional people during the worst cold snap in memory. Children were crying from the cold. Adults were making the kind of hard calculations you never want to make, deciding who gets the warmth and who makes do with whatever's left over. That's when Elias Hartwell did something that changed everything. He opened his underground home to strangers. Now, think about what this meant. For 3 years, people had been calling him crazy, wasteful, blasphemous. The local pastor had been preaching against his project from the pulpit. Neighbors had been taking bets on when his cave dwelling would collapse and kill his whole family. And here comes Hartwell, in the middle of a crisis, offering his home to people who'd probably joined in the ridicule. But when those 17 souls descended into Hartwell's underground world, something magical happened. For the first time, the skeptics experienced the miracle themselves. 58 degrees of steady, reliable warmth. Bright, clean air circulating through passages that felt more like hallways than cave tunnels. Light wells that filled the rooms with actual sunlight, not the dim, smoky glow of oil lamps and fireplaces. The Johnson family. They'd lost 3 children to winter fevers over the past 2 years. They wept when they felt that steady warmth, not the desperate, fluctuating heat of a fire that devours your fuel and dies down in the night, but constant, reliable warmth that didn't require feeding or tending or worry. Johnson told everyone who'd listen that it was like being held by the earth itself. By morning, Hartwell had his first converts. By spring, 4 more families had begun their own excavations under his guidance. The underground revolution had begun. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because it wasn't just Elias who was changing the game. Margaret Hartwell, who'd been quietly managing the household while her husband pursued his underground obsession, emerged as an innovator in her own right. Margaret looked at those light wells her husband had designed for illumination, and she saw something else entirely, the world's first underground greenhouse. Using the light wells and the natural humidity that came from being surrounded by earth, she started growing vegetables in the middle of winter. Not just surviving winter vegetables, mind you. I'm talking about tomatoes in February. Fresh, ripe, delicious tomatoes when the world above ground was frozen solid. Those February tomatoes became legendary. Margaret was selling them for their weight in silver to miners who'd been living on salt pork and hardtack for months. Men would ride 20 miles through snow just to taste something fresh and green. Word spread along the mining circuits and trading routes. There was a woman in Colorado who could grow summer in the middle of winter, and she was doing it underground. The Kowalski family, meanwhile, had adapted their underground space into something nobody saw coming, a dairy operation. Remember Jonas, the Polish quarryman with tuberculosis? Well, his wife Anna had brought 2 milk cows west, and when they moved underground, something remarkable happened. The constant cool temperature, not freezing, not hot, just steady and cool, turned out to be perfect for aging cheese. Their cave gold cheddar became the stuff of frontier legend. Anna was using traditional Polish cheese-making techniques in conditions that were absolutely ideal for the process. The cheese aged slowly and evenly, developing flavors that were unlike anything anyone had tasted before. Within 2 years, Cave Gold cheddar was reaching tables in San Francisco and Chicago, selling for prices that made Anna Kowalski one of the wealthiest women in the territory. But the real transformation came when Dr. Benjamin Fox arrived in the settlement. Fox was a Harvard-educated physician who'd come west to study what he called environmental health factors, basically how where you live affects how healthy you are. What he found in Hartwell's underground community blew his mind. Fox spent 6 months meticulously documenting health outcomes, and his published study showed that children living in underground homes suffered 90% fewer respiratory ailments than their above-ground counterparts. 90%. Think about what that meant in an era when childhood pneumonia was a leading cause of death on the frontier. The constant temperature meant no shocking transitions from freezing cold to overheated cabins. The natural humidity prevented the dry air that cracked sinuses and invited infection. The limestone walls actually filtered the air, removing particulates that would have irritated developing lungs. Without meaning to, Hartwell had created the healthiest living environment on the frontier. Even Reverend Morrison, the pastor who'd condemned Hartwell's project as blasphemy, had to admit he'd been wrong. Morrison started holding services in the underground community room, declaring that perhaps God's warmth rises from below as well as shines from above. That community room became the cultural heart of the settlement, a place where Margaret taught letters to children, where traveling musicians performed for audiences sitting on stone benches carved from the living rock, where philosophical debates raged about humanity's relationship with nature. Hartwell's journal from this period captures his profound realization. We do not conquer the mountain, we accept its embrace. This wasn't just poetic language. This was a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about their relationship with the land. Instead of imposing human will on hostile nature, Hartwell was demonstrating cooperation with natural systems. The underground community was becoming something unprecedented, a place where human ingenuity worked with geological reality instead of against it, where families thrived in harmony with the earth instead of in constant battle against it. But this harmony was about to face its greatest test, and the way Hartwell's people responded would determine whether this underground revolution would spread across the frontier or remain a curious footnote in Colorado history. The spring of 1852 was coming, and with it, an avalanche that would either bury Hartwell's dream forever or prove that human beings really could find safety and prosperity in the heart of the mountain itself. The spring avalanche of 1852 should have been the end of Elias Hartwell's story. Instead, it became the beginning of his legend. Picture this. It's April, the snow is melting fast, and the mountain is essentially reshuffling itself as millions of tons of snow and ice decide to relocate all at once. Hartwell's original entrance, the tunnel he'd spent 3 years digging, the passage that represented everything he'd worked for, gets completely sealed by debris, not just blocked, but buried under 20 feet of rock, snow, and uprooted trees. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have started digging frantically at the sealed entrance, probably triggering more slides and getting themselves killed in the process. But Hartwell wasn't most people. He'd spent 5 years thinking like the mountain, and when the mountain closed one door, he knew it had left him others. The ventilation shafts, those light wells he'd designed to bring sunshine into his underground world, they became his lifeline to the surface. For 48 hours, Hartwell worked his way up through those narrow passages, moving debris piece by piece, creating a new exit where none had existed before. 48 hours underground with limited air, no food, and the constant possibility that the whole system might collapse. When Hartwell finally emerged from that improvised escape route, covered in dirt and rock dust but very much alive, something extraordinary happened. Word of the rescue spread by telegraph faster than wildfire, and suddenly every newspaper from San Francisco to New York was running stories about the man who'd survived being buried alive in his own mountain home. But here's the beautiful part. Hartwell didn't see this as a disaster. He saw it as proof of concept. His underground home had protected him from an avalanche that would have killed anyone living above ground. His ventilation system had provided an escape route when the main entrance failed. His design hadn't just survived nature's worst punch, it had turned that punch into a demonstration of superior engineering. Journalists started arriving. Engineers took trains across the country just to examine Hartwell's construction techniques. Families who'd been skeptical about underground living suddenly wanted to know how they could build their own mountain homes. The man who'd been called crazy for 5 years was suddenly being hailed as a visionary, genius. But here's what makes Hartwell truly remarkable. He refused to capitalize on his fame in the way you'd expect. When people asked about patents, about licensing his techniques, about getting rich off his innovations, Hartwell gave an answer that still echoes today. Warmth belongs to all humanity. He didn't patent his basic construction methods. Anyone who wanted to learn could come to Colorado and spend time with the master himself, learning how to read stone, how to calculate load-bearing requirements, How to create ventilation systems that would work in any geological condition. Hartwell accepted payment in labor, food, or simply stories from distant lands. He was more interested in spreading knowledge than accumulating wealth. By 1855, Hartwell homes were being built from Colorado to Montana. But the most remarkable adaptation came from an unexpected source: the Ferguson family, former slaves who'd made their way west after purchasing their freedom. The Fergusons saw something in Hartwell's techniques that even he hadn't fully realized. Underground construction could create hidden spaces that were literally invisible from the surface. Working with Hartwell's methods but incorporating African building traditions they'd learned from their grandparents, the Fergusons created way stations for the Underground Railroad that were actually underground. Escaped slaves could disappear into the earth itself, completely hidden from bounty hunters and federal marshals. The Ferguson network saved hundreds of lives, using Hartwell's engineering to serve the cause of human freedom. Hartwell himself taught construction methods to anyone who asked, regardless of race, religion, or background. In an era when such attitudes were far from common, the mountain man who'd learned to live beneath the earth had developed a philosophy that valued human dignity above social convention. Standing Bear's influence had taught him that knowledge belongs to all people, and Margaret's practical wisdom had shown him that communities thrive when everyone contributes their best skills. The economic impact of underground construction rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Families who were spending 70% less on winter heating could suddenly afford things that had been impossible luxuries: education for their children, better tools, livestock, books, musical instruments. Entire communities transformed from desperate survival settlements into thriving towns with culture, commerce, and hope for the future. When Elias Hartwell died in 1873, over 2,000 people attended his funeral. 2,000. From across the mountain west, people traveled for days just to pay their respects to the man who'd taught them how to live in harmony with the earth. The service was held in the great underground amphitheater carved by his disciples, a space that could hold 1,000 people in comfort, lit by hundreds of light wells that turned the ceremony into something almost cathedral-like. Margaret lived until 1891, maintaining their original home and teaching greenhouse techniques to a new generation of underground gardeners. She never remarried, never left the mountain, but she didn't live as a recluse. She was the keeper of knowledge, the bridge between Elias's revolutionary vision and the practical needs of families who wanted to build better lives beneath the surface. Here's what's truly remarkable about this story. Modern engineers studying Hartwell's surviving structures still marvel at innovations that were decades ahead of their time. His understanding of thermal mass, how stone and earth could store and release heat, wouldn't be formally studied by academics until the early 1900s. His air circulation systems used principles that wouldn't appear in engineering textbooks until the 1920s. His water management techniques predicted modern hydrology by half a century. Today, earth-sheltered homes using Hartwell's principles save their owners 60 to 85% on heating costs. In an age of climate change and energy scarcity, the techniques developed by a Swedish immigrant with a sledgehammer and an impossible dream are more relevant than ever. The Hartwell Foundation, established by his great-granddaughter in 1976, continues teaching sustainable underground construction techniques to communities worldwide. From refugee camps in Afghanistan to eco-villages in Costa Rica, from disaster relief operations to luxury homes for the environmentally conscious wealthy, Hartwell's legacy lives on in structures that work with natural systems instead of against them. The man who chose to live with the dead rather than die with the living gave us a blueprint for survival that transcends any single era or crisis. But perhaps the most important lesson from Elias Hartwell's story isn't about construction techniques or energy efficiency. It's about the courage to question conventional wisdom when that wisdom is failing people. It's about the willingness to dig deeper, literally and figuratively, when surface solutions aren't working. It's about choosing cooperation over conquest, harmony over dominance, long-term thinking over short-term comfort. In 1847, when 17 graves marked another failed winter, one man looked at the frozen earth and saw not an enemy to be battled, but a mother to be embraced. That choice, to work with nature instead of against it, to build down instead of up, to seek warmth in the heart of the mountain, changed not just his family's fate, but the fate of thousands of families across the American frontier. And in our own time, when we face challenges that seem insurmountable, when conventional solutions are failing and people are suffering, Elias Hartwell's story reminds us that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop fighting the mountain and start asking it to be your home.